close your eyes for a moment, not to rest, to listen, really listen. Because right now, in this exact second, approximately 15,000 microscopic structures inside each of your ears are performing a biological calculation so precise, so staggeringly complex that no computer on Earth has fully replicated it. They are translating the physics of pressure into the experience of meaning. They are turning vibration into thought. They are the reason you heard your child's first word, the reason music moves you to tears, the reason a voice across a room can make your heart accelerate. And they are dying right now in every person reading this over the age of 50, silently, irreversibly, and in most cases, completely without warning. This is not a story about aging. This is a story about the most underestimated biological crisis of the 25th century. A story about a loss that begins decades before it is noticed, accelerates without permission, and carries consequences that extend far beyond the ear itself into the brain, into relationships, into the very architecture of who you are. Welcome to the deepest chamber of human biology. Welcome to the story of sensorineural hearing loss, the condition that affects over 90% of all hearing impaired people on Earth, the condition most strongly associated with cognitive decline, social isolation, and premature aging of the mind, and the condition that modern science is, for the first time in human history, beginning to understand how to reverse. To understand what sensorineural hearing loss destroys, you must first understand what it targets. And what it targets is, without exaggeration, one of the most extraordinary biological structures in the known universe. The cochlea, a spiral-shaped, fluid-filled chamber embedded in the densest bone in the human body, the temporal bone, coiled 2.5 turns like a biological nautilus shell. It measures just 9 millimeters across. It contains more than 30,000 specialized sensory cells, and it converts mechanical vibration into electrochemical neural signals with a signal-to-noise ratio that would make any audio engineer weep with envy. The basilar membrane running the length of the cochlear spiral performs a feat of mechanical engineering that took evolution 300 million years to perfect. It is narrow and stiff at the base, wide and flexible at the apex. This physical gradient means that high-frequency sounds cause maximum vibration near the base, while low frequencies resonate near the apex. Every point along the membrane is tuned to a specific frequency. This is tonotopic organization, the frequency map of human hearing. And sitting on this membrane, riding every vibration like surfers on a frequency wave, are the most sophisticated sensory cells in the human body, the hair cells, 15,000 of them per ear, divided into two populations, 3 rows of outer hair cells that amplify and tune incoming vibrations, and 1 row of inner hair cells that convert mechanical motion into the electrical pulses your brain reads as sound. Each inner hair cell is crowned with a bundle of approximately 60 stereocilia microscopic hair-like projections arranged in a precise staircase pattern. When sound vibrates the basilar membrane, these stereocilia deflect. Their tips are connected by nanometer-scale protein filaments called tip links. When the bundle tilts, these tip links pull open ion channels in the stereocilia membrane. Potassium and calcium flood inward. The electrochemical potential changes, a neurotransmitter is released, and in less than 1 millisecond, a nerve impulse fires toward the brain. This entire molecular cascade from mechanical deflection to neural firing occurs in less than 1 millisecond. 1,000th of a second, repeated up to 20,000 times per second for high-frequency sounds. This is not biology. This is precision engineering at the molecular scale. This is the most sensitive mechanical detector in the natural world, operating continuously, faithfully across an entire human lifetime. The outer hair cells add another layer of genius. They are not just receivers, they are active amplifiers. They contain a unique motor protein called prestin, which allows them to physically change their length in synchrony with incoming sound waves, amplifying basilar membrane vibration by up to 40 decibels before the inner hair cells even detect it. They are living biological amplifiers running continuously with no battery, no power supply beyond the electrochemical gradient maintained by the cochlea itself. The cochlea also maintains a highly specialized ionic environment, the endocochlear potential, a standing electrical voltage of approximately 80 millivolts generated by the stria vascularis, a region of specialized cells lining the outer wall of the cochlear duct. This potential is the biological battery that powers the entire system. It is the silent engine behind every sound you have ever heard, and it is the first thing to degrade with age. Sensorineural hearing loss is defined as a reduction in hearing sensitivity caused by damage or dysfunction in the cochlea, the auditory nerve, or the central auditory pathways of the brain. Unlike conductive hearing loss, which blocks sound mechanically in the outer or middle ear, sensorineural loss strikes at the biological machinery of sound detection itself. When hair cells die, no signal reaches the auditory nerve. When the auditory nerve degenerates, no signal reaches the brain. When central auditory pathways rewire in response to chronic deprivation, the brain itself changes. Each layer of this cascade operates with remorseless biological independence. And each layer, once damaged beyond a threshold, does not regenerate. The cells do not grow back. The nerve fibers do not reconnect. The loss, in most cases, is permanent. The global scale of sensorineural hearing loss defies easy comprehension. Approximately 1.5 billion people worldwide live with some degree of hearing loss. Of these, over 430 million require rehabilitation. And across all forms of hearing loss, sensorineural represents more than 90% of diagnosed cases. It is not a rare condition. It is an epidemic measured in billions of lives advancing quietly across the most connected civilization in human history. The most common cause of sensorineural hearing loss in adults over 50 has a name that most people have never heard, and a biological process that has been reshaping their hearing for decades before a single symptom appeared. Presbycusis, age-related hearing loss, a condition so universal that medicine once dismissed it as an inevitable consequence of growing older rather than what it actually is, a preventable, treatable, progressive disease with a specific molecular mechanism. Presbycusis begins not in the 60s, not in the 50s. Research now confirms that measurable hair cell loss and cochlear degeneration begin in the third decade of life, in the 30s, decades before any subjective awareness of change. By the age of 60, approximately 1/3 of cochlear outer hair cells in the high-frequency basal region are typically gone. By 70, that figure rises to over 50% in many individuals. The process has a characteristic topographic pattern. It begins at the base of the cochlea, the high-frequency region, and advances steadily toward the apex over years and decades. This is why the first hearing frequencies to deteriorate in most adults are in the range of 4,000 to 8,000 hertz. The high-pitched consonants of speech, the S, F, Sh, Th, P sounds become progressively harder to distinguish. Speech begins to sound muffled rather than quiet, clear rather than absent, present but incomprehensible. This is the insidious signature of presbycusis that makes it so clinically dangerous. It does not announce itself with silence. It announces itself with confusion, with the need to ask people to repeat themselves, with the conviction that other people have started mumbling, with the discovery that restaurants have become acoustically overwhelming, with the gradual, rationalized, socially acceptable withdrawal from situations that are simply too acoustically demanding to navigate.
I
The
honestly
brain,
couldn't
with its
believe it when she
extraordinary
told me the
capacity
story.
for
Wait, you were there
adaptation,
for that.
compensates silently and
Oh, it
efficiently.
was hilarious,
It draws from
trust me.
context, lip reading, memory, and prediction to fill the gaps in auditory information. For months, sometimes years, this compensation is seamless enough that neither the patient nor their family notices the decline. The brain is doing the hearing work the cochlea can no longer provide until the deficit exceeds the brain's compensatory capacity, and the silence becomes impossible to ignore. At the molecular level, presbycusis is driven by multiple converging processes. Mitochondrial DNA mutations accumulate in the metabolically demanding hair cells, impairing their energy production. Oxidative stress, the accumulation of reactive oxygen species generated as a byproduct of cochlear energy metabolism, progressively damages both hair cells and the stria vascularis. The endocochlear potential, that 80 millivolt biological battery, begins to decline. And as the battery weakens, the sensitivity of every remaining hair cell falls with it. But age alone does not explain the full picture. Presbycusis is accelerated profoundly, measurably, irreversibly by a second force that operates in parallel, that has been damaging your cochlea since your teenage years, and that the overwhelming majority of people have been told almost nothing about. Noise, not just the noise of factories and construction sites, the noise of concerts, headphones, sporting events, urban traffic, and the recreational soundscape of modern life. Noise-induced sensorineural hearing loss is one of the most prevalent and entirely preventable causes of permanent cochlear damage. When sound pressure levels exceed approximately 85 decibels sustained over time, the mechanical forces exerted on the stereocilia exceed their structural tolerance. The tip-link snap, the stereocilia bundle collapses. The hair cell, unable to transduce sound, attempts a metabolic recovery. Often it fails. The cell undergoes apoptosis, programmed self-destruction, and it is gone forever. A single exposure to an acoustic impulse above 130 decibels, a gunshot, an explosion, a firework at close range can destroy thousands of hair cells in a single millisecond. The damage is immediate, anatomically specific, and complete. No treatment currently exists that can reverse it. The cells do not regenerate. The hearing does not return. The loss is as permanent as a scar. But the more pervasive danger is not the single catastrophic event. It is the chronic, cumulative, below-threshold exposure that modern life has normalized. Recreational music played through earbuds at 70 to 80% volume. Concerts measuring 100 to 110 decibels. Sports bars averaging 90 decibels of ambient noise. Each exposure individually may produce only a temporary threshold shift, a temporary reduction in hearing sensitivity lasting hours or days. But each exposure also produces metabolic stress, glutamate excitotoxicity at the inner hair cell synapse, and cumulative mitochondrial damage that advances the timeline of permanent loss. The audiogram of noise-induced hearing loss carries a specific forensic signature, the 4,000 hertz notch. A sharp, characteristic dip in hearing threshold at precisely 4,000 hertz, reflecting the anatomical region of the cochlea most mechanically vulnerable to acoustic overexposure. When an audiologist sees this pattern in a person under 60, it is not aging. It is a history of sound exposure written in biological data. It is decades of recreational noise leaving its permanent mark on the basilar membrane. If you have ever removed headphones after a long listening session and noticed that the world sounded slightly muffled, slightly distant, that was not imagination. That was temporary hair cell dysfunction. That was your cochlea telling you, in the only language it has available, that the exposure was excessive. And each time this happens, without full recovery, the cumulative biological debt grows larger and the permanent threshold of that silence moves closer. There is a third pathway by which sensorineural hearing loss can be inflicted on the cochlea, and it arrives not through sound at all, but through the bloodstream. Ototoxicity. The direct chemical damage of cochlear structures by pharmaceutical compounds, environmental toxins, and industrial chemicals. More than 200 pharmaceutical compounds have documented ototoxic potential. The aminoglycoside, antibiotics, gentamicin, tobramycin, streptomycin accumulate in cochlear endolymph and preferentially destroy outer hair cells from the base toward the apex. Platinum-based chemotherapy agents, cisplatin, carboplatin, generate reactive oxygen species within hair cells that trigger apoptosis in a dose-dependent cumulative pattern. Loop diuretics taken at high doses can reversibly damage the stria vascularis. Quinine derivatives can cause temporary tinnitus and threshold elevation. For patients undergoing cancer chemotherapy, ototoxic hearing loss is not a theoretical risk. It is a clinical reality experienced by up to 60% of patients receiving cisplatin-based regimens. The cruelty of this particular loss is its compounding nature. The patient survives their malignancy only to face a progressive, permanent hearing impairment that compounds isolation, reduces quality of life, and in older patients significantly accelerates cognitive decline. The treatment for one disease becomes the cause of another. Environmental and occupational ototoxic exposures extend the scope further. Chronic exposure to organic solvents, toluene, styrene, xylene found in paints, adhesives, and industrial cleaning agents has documented synergistic ototoxic potential, particularly when combined with noise exposure. Carbon monoxide. Heavy metals including mercury, lead, and arsenic. The cochlea, consuming extraordinary metabolic resources to maintain its ionic environment and amplification function, is uniquely vulnerable to any chemical disruption of its energy supply or oxidative balance. But the cochlear hair cells are not the only casualty of sensorineural hearing loss. Behind them, physically connecting each inner hair cell to the brainstem, is the auditory nerve, the eighth cranial nerve, carrying approximately 30,000 nerve fibers that must maintain their structural integrity and their synaptic connections with hair cells across an entire lifetime. Research published over the past decade has revealed a phenomenon called hidden hearing loss cochlear synaptopathy. Even in individuals whose audiogram appears normal, whose hair cells appear intact, and whose detection thresholds are within normal limits, the synaptic connections between inner hair cells and their afferent nerve fibers can be significantly depleted. These synapses, once lost, do not regenerate, and their loss produces a specific measurable deficit. Difficulty understanding speech in background noise, even when the audiogram says nothing is wrong. This is the clinical reality underlying one of the most common complaints in audiology. The patient who says, "I can hear fine in quiet environments, but put me in a restaurant, a party, any noisy room, and I cannot follow a single conversation." Their doctor tests their hearing and tells them it is normal, but it is not normal. The synapses are gone. The nerve fibers are operating with reduced redundancy. The signal quality under challenging acoustic conditions is permanently degraded. Hidden hearing loss, invisible on standard tests, profoundly real in daily life. Beyond synaptopathy, primary auditory nerve degeneration can occur independently of hair cell loss. Neural presbycusis, characterized by degeneration of spiral ganglion neurons and their central axonal projections, produces a distinct audiometric pattern, disproportionate difficulty with speech comprehension relative to the degree of pure tone threshold elevation. The hair cells may still be functioning, but the downstream nerve fibers are thinning. The neural bandwidth of the auditory system is narrowing. And now we arrive at the dimension of sensorineural hearing loss that most people, and until recently, most clinicians have failed to fully comprehend. The ear is not where sound ends. The ear is where sound begins its neurological journey. And when that journey is interrupted, the destination changes. The auditory cortex occupies the superior temporal gyrus of both cerebral hemispheres, but it does not operate in isolation. It is densely interconnected with Broca's area for language processing, the hippocampus for memory consolidation, the prefrontal cortex for attention and working memory, and the limbic system for emotional processing of sound. Hearing is not a single function. It is a distributed cognitive process, and it is dependent on continuous, rich, accurate acoustic input to maintain its structural organization. When cochlear input is reduced by sensorineural hearing loss, the auditory cortex does not simply receive less information passively. It begins to reorganize. Cortical maps shift. Regions previously dedicated to sound processing begin to be colonized by adjacent sensory domains. Visual and somatosensory inputs begin to occupy auditory real estate. This cross-modal plasticity is the brain's attempt at adaptation, but it comes at a profound cognitive cost. The cognitive resources redirected toward compensating for degraded auditory input come at the direct expense of other mental functions. Every conversation that requires effortful listening, every sentence reconstructed from incomplete acoustic information, draws from the same cognitive reservoir that powers memory, consolidation, executive planning, and emotional regulation. The hearing impaired brain is not simply receiving less sound. It is running a continuous, invisible cognitive deficit, spending resources on auditory reconstruction that are no longer available for the full range of mental life. Structural MRI studies show measurable, objective differences in temporal lobe gray matter volume between age-matched individuals with and without hearing loss. Functional imaging reveals reduced neural efficiency, greater cognitive effort for identical auditory tasks, and accelerated patterns of neural deactivation consistent with early cognitive aging. The brain of an untreated hearing-impaired person ages faster. This is not a metaphor. It is a measurable, quantifiable, scannable biological reality. There is no pharmacological agent currently capable of regenerating cochlear hair cells in the human ear. No drug, no supplement, no surgical procedure can restore a dead hair cell to function. This biological reality defines the treatment landscape for sensorineural hearing loss, and it means that the primary interventions are not curative but rehabilitative. Yet, the word rehabilitative dramatically undersells what modern technology is now capable of delivering. Modern digital hearing aids bear almost no resemblance to the analog amplification devices of a generation ago. Contemporary instruments use multiple microphones, directional processing algorithms, and artificial intelligence-driven sound classification to distinguish speech from noise with millisecond precision. They apply frequency-specific amplification calibrated to the individual audiogram, amplifying only the frequencies the patient's cochlea can no longer adequately detect. They adjust dynamically to hundreds of different acoustic environments per hour. For individuals with sensorineural loss, where the cochlea remains partially functional, hearing aids can produce transformative outcomes. Studies show significant improvements in speech comprehension, reduced listening effort, reduced cognitive fatigue, and in multiple prospective trials, measurable attenuation of cognitive decline rates compared to matched untreated controls. Wearing a hearing aid is not vanity management. It is brain protection. It is, according to the current evidence base, the most accessible and impactful single intervention for reducing dementia risk available to any adult over 50 with documented hearing loss. And yet, fewer than 20% of adults who would clinically benefit from hearing aids actually wear them. The average delay between first awareness of hearing difficulty and seeking professional evaluation is over 7 years. 7 years of progressive neural degeneration, 7 years of cognitive overload, 7 years of social withdrawal, 7 years of dementia risk accumulating without intervention. This is not a failure of technology. This is a failure failure of awareness, one that this video exists to address. Audiologists describe a moment that recurs across their entire clinical career, a moment that never becomes ordinary, no matter how many times they witness it. A patient puts on their hearing aids for the first time, or a cochlear implant is activated, and the world returns. Not as it was. The cochlea does not regenerate. The hair cells do not grow back, but as something richer than the silence that had replaced it. The patient hears the air conditioning, hears the clock, hears the audiologist's voice with a clarity they had forgotten existed, and they weep not from sadness, from arrival. The hair cells of the cochlea are the most irreplaceable structures in the human body. They represent the biological interface between the physical world and the experiencing mind. We do not grow them back. We do not regenerate them with any currently available clinical treatment. We have precisely one opportunity to protect them, and that opportunity is the present moment before the damage has exceeded the threshold of intervention, before the cognitive reorganization has advanced beyond recovery, before the social withdrawal has become a way of life. Every 85 decibel concert is a choice. Every hour of headphone use at dangerous volume is a choice. Every year spent without a hearing evaluation is a choice. Every hearing aid left in a drawer because of perceived stigma is a choice. And the aggregate of these choices determines not only what you will hear in your 70s and 80s, it determines how clearly you will think, how fully you will connect, and how long your mind will retain the coherent, rich, engaged presence that defines a life fully inhabited. The inner ear is not a passive recipient of whatever fate delivers. It is a biological system, and like every biological system, it responds to the quality of its environment, the intelligence of its protection, and the promptness of its repair. The cochlea cannot shout its own distress. It cannot tell you when its hair cells are depleted or when its endocochlear potential is declining. It simply grows quieter and then quieter still until the world you built your life inside recedes beyond the range of the system that was meant to keep you connected to it. You live in a world of extraordinary sound, the voice of someone who loves you, the music that has followed you through every chapter of your life, the laughter of people who are glad you are in the room. These sounds are not background. They are the substance of a human life. Protect them with every tool available. Pursue them with every ounce of biological intelligence this conversation has placed in your hands. And understand deeply, without reservation, that the decision to protect your hearing is the decision to protect your mind, your connections, and the irreplaceable texture of your remaining years. Thank you for going this deep into the biology that makes you who you are. If this reached you, if something in this investigation has changed the way you think about your cochlea, your cognitive future, or the extraordinary, irreplaceable gift of a life in full sound, please share it. Because knowledge delivered at the right moment is the most protective force in medicine. Subscribe, and I will meet you in the next chapter of your biology.